Hillary Clinton is about to finally make it official. Democrats familiar with her plans tell ABC News that she is poised to announce she is running for president as soon as this weekend. Mrs. Clinton has already signed a lease on the office that will become her campaign headquarters. That'll be in Brooklyn, and she has assembled a full campaign team.
Let's get down to brass tacks. Our guest is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, in the loop intelligence officer, and senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, who understands how politics and foreign policy intertwine. Tony Shaffer joins us again. Lieutenant Colonel, always a pleasure. Good to see you.
Hey, Ed, good to be on. Thanks for having me.
Is your perhaps greatest fear is that Hillary Clinton will get into the race and she will be elected president because the people of America, or at least a majority, will not hold her accountable for all of her foreign affairs problems and failures?
Well, I think that's a great place to start with a discussion of Ms. Clinton. First, she touts herself as someone, quote unquote, fully qualified for the office of president. And I and others, I like to believe, have been kind of looking at that hard. It's like, okay, you served as the most traveled Secretary of State, but under your watch, Madam Secretary, you had a number of very catastrophic failures. First, the so-called reset with Russia. We all know where that went, and more importantly, the Middle East is now, from the mishandling of Arab Spring, is completely on fire. So, Ed, if that's any example of what we can expect from a President Hillary Clinton, I just don't know what to say. I am speechless.
What about all those who would say, Tony, that every president comes in and they need help? It's the people that they surround themselves with, and these are the people that help to shape their foreign policy. Right. And you know there are people who will say that if Hillary Clinton gets elected, she will put the right people around her. So don't worry about all these things in the past.
I make no secret of the fact that I'm a Reagan Republican personally, and that many of my friends and mentors are former officials of President Reagan. So I couldn't agree more. As a president, you are obligated to bring in the best and the brightest who can help you do your job and be successful in the execution of that job. I haven't seen that from this president. I have seen nothing but the selection of individuals who are completely unqualified for the positions they hold. I've said before on your show, I will say it again, it's as if the high school debating team is in charge. You cannot afford to hire ideologues who simply agree with you politically but cannot think outside of that very minute box. And what we have to have, Ed, is someone who understands the game of chess, not the game of checkers. And Ms. Clinton, unfortunately for President Obama, he may have selected her for all the reasons you mentioned. Maybe he thought that she would be an adequate, if not exemplary, Secretary of State. The contrary proved to be true. She was an abysmal Secretary of State with no real accomplishments. So I agree that you need to select someone who can help you as president. Frankly, if you become president after having such an abysmal record, I think you would probably continue to pick people who were equally unqualified to help you.
Tony, you used the word adequate there for a moment. As we look around at all of the various Republicans who are now coming in, those also who want to be president, is there anybody, in your opinion, that you can look at right now and say is more than adequate, or at least has a good idea of what foreign policy and war is all about? Let
me be clear on this, and I would even advise President Hillary Clinton's team on foreign policy if they ask for the help. I would prefer to look at each candidate for what they do regarding outreach and research right now while they're running for office. Each candidate will have a blind spot regarding national security. A lot of folks have not served in this area. It is not quite rocket science, but it's pretty darn close. So you have to have people who are willing to be educated. I would like to believe that Ms. Clinton, as much as I've just said very critical things of her, would perhaps even want to wise up a bit and bring in some fresh faces to advise her. So I would say the same thing about the Republican candidates. You've got to stay away from the same folks who say the same thing over and over in here. And let me name two institutions which I believe are just not able to carry the weight they used to. The Brookings Institution, I think, has been completely compromised by money from the left. And let me speak bluntly here, the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation, I think, has renounced its view of really hard-biting factual national security. So I think you've got to bring in fresh faces from the real world, all of those who've had experience actually dealing with national security. And I would point to those who, from both sides, Tony Zinni, who worked for President Clinton, Bud McFarlane, who worked for President Reagan. You've got to bring in people who have real experience and real success rather than the old political class who continue to say the same thing over and over.
The old guard, we've talked about that many times. We're going to talk
We
about
have.
it a little more here in just a couple of minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, please hang on, because we're going to turn next to that foreign policy. Because Iran wants all sanctions lifted as soon as any agreement is finalized. And Pakistan is snubbing Saudi Arabia in order to stay neutral during the crisis in Yemen. It is a tinderbox. Let's dig into it with Tony Shaffer when we continue right here on MidPoint. All right, on to the reality of what's transpiring with regard to foreign policy, wars, and politics with retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and intelligence analyst Tony Shaffer. Tony, let's go ahead and then turn overseas. The Ayatollah Khamenei, they all pretty much, I guess, they may have different names, but they all sound alike, whatever they say, now accuses the White House of lying, being deceptive, having devilish intentions. The framework lasted, I guess, maybe 2 or 3 days. Is this really something that we need to pay attention to, or is this just a really bad actor playing up to his own people and to his own government?
No. This is all real. This is one of the things which I think this administration has just not been able to accept, not willing to accept. The Iranians, Ed, are playing for time. It is to their advantage to continue to kick the can down the road. That's why you see them coming up to being very close to an agreement. I tend to agree with the critics of this Iran agreement, saying that there was really no agreement ever. That because they never issued a joint statement that both sides agreed upon, one single sheet of paper with all the points both sides agreed to, there was really no agreement. I tend to believe that the Iranians are the more accurate here. Not completely accurate, but more accurate. And all they want to do, Ed, is get to June, and then when we get to June, they want to kick it down the can to October. Their objective, the Iranian objective, is to keep things going as long as possible. Some of the sanctions have been reduced a bit during the negotiations. And this most recent thing within the last 48 hours of them saying, no, we want more, is indicative of their process. And they learned this, by the way, from the North Koreans. The North Koreans are masters of this. The Iranians watched, and now they're emulating the North Korean bad behavior, probably even doing it better. So I think the White House has to wise up here and quit, basically giving in to every demand. They've got to come to a point of where they say enough's enough. And President Obama keeps saying, well, the alternate is war. No, the alternate is not war. It is suing for a better agreement where you hold the Iranians accountable. That's something they've not been willing to do. And obviously, the Iranians are bad actors all through the Middle East, most recently Yemen, with support to the Houthi, who are actually destabilizing that region to the point of where Al-Qaeda and ISIS will both have a larger free access to ungoverned space to launch operations from.
Tony, you're one of the few people that I can ask this question to, because this won't sound journalistically correct, but it will be like a couple of guys sitting in a bar someplace, basically having a simple conversation. Is it fair to say then, let's stop beating around the bush and just call Iran, and again, this would be your opinion, just a bunch of religious zealot wackos who will basically put their finger on the button at any time simply because it's bright and shiny and it looks good and they can do it?
Let me answer that in two pieces. First, you have people in Iran, Persians, who are perfectly rational. They are scientific human beings who are very tied to science. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a credible nuclear program. That credible nuclear program has been fueled by China and the Pakistanis, who have sold them the roadmap to establish nuclear technology. So that's one piece. They have rational people who are as rational as you and me. Separate from that, you have a ruling class, a hierarchy who are religious zealots, as you mentioned, and they're the ones in charge. So when you put the two together, you have real questions about the long-term viability and stability of that nation. Let's note here, and it's not now classified technically, the Israelis have a nuclear program. The Saudis, for example, have had nuclear-capable missiles since the 90s. They purchased these things from the Chinese. Yet, Ed, the Saudis never once attempted to take delivery of the nuclear warheads from Pakistan they've paid for. Why? Because they trusted the Israelis to be rational. That's why now the Saudis all of a sudden are now talking about arming these nuclear-capable missiles they purchased from the Chinese back in the 90s. Why? Because the Saudis don't believe the Iranians to be rational. And the moment that the Iranians have there's credible evidence of the Iranians having nuclear weapons with, by the way, a nuclear delivery system like an ICBM, that's when you see a vast expansion of all the powers in the Middle East, starting with the Saudis, to be nuclear capable. We will see an arms race like we've not seen since the end of the Cold War.
So then basically, when it comes down to the Iranian government, the short answer to my question is yes.
Yes, the short answer is yes.
Okay, I got about a minute left here. Washington says that they're not going to stand by while Tehran supports the Shiite rebels in Yemen, so they're basically sending a warning. Is there any reason for us to believe this warning is going to do anything at all? This just sounds like hot air.
It is. It's a warning. It's like, hey, we don't like this. We think a warning like that without action is completely meaningless. We've seen this with Putin. Come on, these people play for keeps. If you're out there doing hashtags and Twitter feed, things saying, "Oh no, shame on you," it's going to have no effect. And frankly, between you and me and your audience, I think the White House is purposely allowing the Houthi to be successful by the fact that they want no other pressure brought on the Iranian nuclear deal. And I think that could be seen as an adverse effect on that nuclear deal. And I think it's going to hurt our allies, the Saudis and the Egyptians, in dealing with Yemen.
30 seconds here. The Pakistani parliament
Sure.
votes to stay out of the conflict in Yemen. Does that really say anything at all to the overall power struggle here?
Pakistan is still essentially a satellite state in many ways of the Saudis. I don't see this as good or bad. I see it as practical. The Pakistanis have their own problems right now, both with the Taliban growing in strength and becoming an internal threat, as well as ISIS now expanding in Pakistan as well. I think it's their focus should be what it is, focusing on maintaining their own stability because they are a nuclear state, and I think both ISIS and Al Qaeda would love to see about them destabilized for purposes of getting their hands on nuclear weapons.
Good, clear talk. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll do it again soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, stay tuned because MidPoint will continue.